That's an awesome picture, Lane.
All right.
Welcome back, everybody. This is great. Glad to have you here with us, and glad to have our next two speakers as well. So this morning we heard a few things. We started with Marcella giving us a broad overview of pine-dominated forest types across the Lake States. We had a breakout where you collected some thoughts and questions that are of interest to you. Then we heard from Carrie Pike and Nick Labonte, two forest geneticists, with brief overviews of the genetics of our three native pine species. You may have seen on the event page, we're organizing the day kind of around this, and you heard from our speakers this idea of myth busting or looking back at what we know from history. Tomorrow we'll talk about current practices, and then on Thursday we'll kind of look to the future with a focus on climate adaptation and related topics. Lane is a researcher with the Cloquet Forestry Center. Lane and I see a lot of each other up in Cloquet. He has been involved in some fascinating research around cultural and ecological roles of fire, looking at tree rings, dendrochronology, and how that can inform our current understanding of how these systems were shaped and what forces were shaping them. Really glad to have Lane with us. I'll leave it at that, but Lane Johnson, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Eli. So since Eli already introduced me, here's a picture of me in my element. I am classically trained as a geographer and a tree ring researcher, a dendrochronologist, and my bread and butter is applied historical ecology. I use tree rings to answer questions related to the past and the history of our forests, specifically our fire-dependent forests. Oftentimes when I talk about this topic, I get accused of being nostalgic, and you know, I suppose I can be at times, but the past really does matter, and our understanding of where we are in the present and where we're headed in the future is really dependent on our understanding of the past. So we know that forests are complex time-lag systems. The forests of today are the result of ecocultural processes that have been at work centuries into the past. And stewarding our forests for the future is really about sustaining processes that have perpetuated these systems over their evolutionary history. And we know that fire has been the primary process that has shaped and perpetuated the pine systems of the Upper Great Lakes for millennia. And red pine, jack pine, white pine, all of these species contain information within their annual growth rings that can tell us about how fire functioned in these systems long into the past. Tree rings have unmatched temporal and spatial precision as an environmental proxy. So we have annually resolved records anywhere that trees are growing on the landscape, and that makes them a really powerful tool for understanding how fire and other ecosystem processes have functioned and been a part of these systems. In the Lake States, red pine is our most reliable recorder of fire history records. Other species of pine, oaks, cedar, they can all hold fire scar records within their annual growth rings. The red pine by far is the best record we can find in our landscapes as far as time depth and information richness. And so when we talk about fire history across all of our pine systems, we're really relying on red pine fire records to inform just our understanding of disturbance processes across multiple types of pine systems, whether that's red pine systems, white pine dominated, jack pine dominated, northern mixed hardwoods even. And fire scars are an incredible proxy for understanding fire in the past. They provide not just annual, but subannual records of non-lethal fire in our fire-dependent systems. And we can, assign or know what the fire effects are at a single tree on the landscape, with precision. So here's a couple forest scenes from north of where I live in Duluth, Minnesota. And you can see that, we know that at the beginning of the 20th century, our landscapes in the Great Lakes really saw dramatic changes. And we had massive amounts of clear-cut logging, followed by land clearing for farming. And then, of course, many of these areas that were heavily impacted by land clearing and timber harvest subsequently burned. And they burned again. And areas that were not necessarily cut also burned. And so what happened is we had this massive transformation of our forested landscape, and people that were in charge of our timber resources across the Great Lakes were really concerned about timber drought because of unregulated harvest and widespread fire. And so there's this very concerted effort across the region, beginning as early as the 1890s, to make sure that all fires were put out and that people were not lighting fires in these landscapes. And as a result, the forests that have regenerated since the turn of the century, the forests that we see today are forests that have developed in the absence of fire. And the forests that perhaps our grandparents or great grandparents were familiar with, we really don't have any good perspective of, because of how slowly forests change over time and how quickly or how short-lived we are as people. So for an example, here's a red pine forest scene in the picnic area at the Cloquet Forestry Center in 1928. And if you drive through the forestry center today, you can see that this really dramatic change in the structure and composition of our forests in the absence of fire. In essence, we have forgotten the relationship between fire and our pine systems because things have changed so much. There's a term for our forgetfulness, our ecological amnesia. And in the literature, you can find this as shifting baseline syndrome. It's this socio-psychological phenomenon in which historical environmental information has been lost over time, and that people really don't notice changes in biological systems because of those losses and how gradually they occur. So it's a persistent downgrading of perceived normal environmental conditions with every sequential generation, and it leads to an underestimation of the true magnitude of long-term environmental change at a global scale, but also at the local level. But fortunately, we have tree ring records and we have fire-scarred material out on the landscape that can help us remember what these systems used to look like and how they used to function prior to fire suppression and fire exclusion. And if you zoom in on a cat-faced stump, or if you stick your face into a cat face of a living pine, you'll see these kind of ripples of healing wood at the base of the tree. And each one of these sort of ripples or vertical seams that kind of looks like the seams of an accordion is evidence of a historical fire. So here's a tree, a red pine, that has at least 12 fires recorded at its base over its life history. It's still living. Here's an example from the Chippewa National Forest, a large living red pine that was growing in a scientific natural area, or a research natural area rather, surrounded by red maple and other hardwoods. But this tree is living and has a record of 15 fires on its bole, suggesting that this site looked much different than it does at present. We have remnants across the landscape, red pine remnants that look like this, that are surrounded by young forest, and they also provide a source of information. Wind-thrown pine, likewise, can have great records of fire when we seek them out. And when we go find these records in what I consider to be special places in the landscape, parks, wilderness areas, areas that have been less heavily managed and manipulated over the past 100 years. We can collect these tree ring fire records and find that they're loaded with great place-based information. And we can bring these back to the lab and lump them together into sites and spend a lot of time poring over what these records tell us. And we end up getting calendar dates and seasonality for these records that go back into the 1700s, 1600s, sometimes even the 1500s. And really the consistent theme across all of these records is that the fire stopped around 1900. So when it comes to characterizing fire regimes, we use tree rings to study the spatial and temporal aspects of a fire regime, or how fire operates within a fire environment. And we can get metrics, quantitative metrics related to frequency. We can get quantitative and qualitative information related to fire severity. We can pull seasonality information. We can get information on area burned or sizes of fires, spatial patterns, and then last but not least, the cultural context that we assign these fire records really inform how we interpret frequency, severity, seasonality, size, and pattern. And what these fire history records tell us across the landscape is that our pine systems, our red pine systems in particular, but really these are always mixed pine systems. So here we've got predominantly a red pine stand that's got a jack pine component, and present day it has more white pine in it. These were not forests historically, they were woodlands. And when we talk about woodlands, we're really saying that forest has a very simple kind of vertical structure, overstory trees, open understory, really lush and vigorous ground flora, productive ground flora, not a lot of shrubs, not a lot of underbrush, very few understory trees that are growing in these sites. And this is what millions of acres of our pine systems in the Great Lakes looked like historically. And they had really vibrant, productive early and mid-successional plant communities that wildlife species depended on. And in the absence of fire, much of these systems have been lost or degraded, the ones that haven't been cut. And so what I'm trying to communicate is that if we consider our different pine systems kind of occurring across a spectrum of densities from barrens to forest, historically fire kind of held our pine systems in more of a barren, savanna, open woodland or closed woodland state. And over the last 100 years, we have, in the absence of fire's presence, we have seen a lot of these systems be converted into either closed or forest woodlands. And it just so happens that the conditions that these pine systems are best perpetuated in are more in this barren, savanna, or open woodland sort of state. So we can pull fire frequency information from these tree ring records. We can take really cruddy pieces of wood and get these incredible high resolution findings. So here's a really thin section of red pine that was likely harvested around 1898, 1899. And just the cap face portion of the tree is left, and we can see that fires were recorded on this tree as far back as 1769. And then the last one that is preserved is 1863. So we can take these point events and we can put them into these graphical representations of fire occurrence. So in this example here, every single horizontal line that's shown is representing the life of an individual tree, and the triangles there are representing events. And we will pull records from individual trees and lump them into sites. And we can also pull them into sort of like regional scale assessments. And regardless of what scale we look at these records in, sites or landscapes or regions, it's just mind-blowing how much fire was present in our landscapes. So here's a fire chart representing tree ring records from Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, the Voyageurs National Park, and a few other places in northeastern Minnesota. And there's lots of things that we can describe here pattern-wise over space and time. But what I'm really trying to point out here is how much fire we saw in our landscapes historically prior to 1900, and how little fire our tree ring record is picking up over the last 100 years and really are in present day time. And the fire history information we're pulling from these tree ring records really are not reflected in the models that we use to understand fire across the Great Lakes and other parts of the country. But here's land fire data that shows the importance of fire across the Great Lakes region using the historic mean fire interval in years. You can see that in northeastern Minnesota and other parts of Wisconsin and Michigan, we have large ecoregions that are presumed to have MFIs, mean fire return intervals, of 70 plus years. And the reality is that there are sites or landscapes within these ecoregions that were burning at intervals of 5 to 10 to 15 to 20, 25 years on average. And that has understanding that's really important for understanding fire risk, how much these systems have changed, and really what they need to be perpetuated. When we're talking about fire risk, I guess we can talk about fire severity. And historically, we know that our pine systems were mixed severity. We had high overstory tree survivorship in many events, but we did have, I guess, high tree mortality in the understory, or I guess across horizontal space. We had kind of gaps or sort of patchy fire effects that created openings and opportunities for young pine to regenerate in gaps, fire gaps. And in the absence of fire, this is the exact same site 100 years later, and you can see how much these forests have changed as they have infilled in the absence of fire. And so here's that slide again, just reiterating. And that one again, sorry, duplicates. So anyhow, we see just a mix of different kind of forest conditions in historical photos that I would consider to be sort of savannas or open woodlands. Here you've got white pine, but still a fairly open understory. And so like these photos really are representing what our pine systems should probably look like if we're interested in their ecological integrity, their biodiversity, and their function. So just another example from Itasca State Park area. And then this is Itasca State Park today, these pine systems. Dense balsam fir understories. In other places where we don't have balsam, we have thick hazelbrush and other species like red maple that are inhibiting pine regeneration. How could I forget aspen? Aspen as well. So then next, we can pull seasonality information from these fire records. Here's a microscope image showing an 1809 and an 1813 set of fires. And we can see that there's sort of diversity and seasonality in the tree ring record that we can detect. 1809 was a mid or late summer fire. 1813 was a dormant season fire that we infer as a spring event. And so this pyrodiversity from year to year gives us a lot of flexibility as managers. So here's a site on the Chequamegon National Forest, where fire has been returned to a former pine plantation that was mechanically thinned and then burned at least once. And as we look to maintain these systems over the long term, we don't just have to be managing these sites with dormant season or spring season fire. We can be burning really year round. We can be burning in the summer when our spring fire season is over. Our summer fire season turns into a fall fire season. And even in the winter, we can be using those kind of periods of time to be doing mechanical treatments and pile burns to set up sites for prescribed fire in the coming fire season, prescribed fire season. So then talking about fire size, we have this growing network of tree ring fire history records across the Great Lakes region that's really exciting. And we've got fire history researchers from different institutions and different agencies that are coming together to combine their expertise to understand how these records can be used from sites to regions to inform forest management. And one of the things that's stunning when we look at these fire records at the regional level or the Great Lakes sort of level is that there are fire years or series of fire years that are common across all of these yellow dots that you see here. So 1863, 1864, huge fire year that shows up across the Lake states. Likewise, 1894 and 1895, and again, 1909, 1910, and that's just a handful of fire years that really occurred likely over many millions of acres in the Lake states. And I bring that up just as sort of a myth busting thing that the large fires we see on our landscape today, the Kami Creek fire, September 2011, 93,000 acres, that's really a tiny fire when we look at the tree ring record and we understand how widespread fire years were prior to fire suppression and land use change. Of course, the fire effects within these large fires are that we are seeing over the modern period are much different. So we're talking about spatial patterns now. Fire historically burned in a mosaic. So we had a lot of tree survivorship because fire was either low severity or mixed severity. And that created a diversity of different habitats and kind of conditions or sort of microclimates for pine to regenerate in. And as you have fire kind of reoccur in these sites over decades, these patterns are sort of reinforced. And we can mimic a lot of these patterns with our mechanical treatments today and then reinforce them or add even more kind of complexity by using prescribed fire as sort of paired treatment following those mechanical treatments. In the absence of using fire and in the absence of really mimicking of sort of the historical character of these systems in our present day management, we have situations where we have fires that are burning big and hot and out of control, and the amount of pine survivorship we have in these burns is shockingly low to me. And we can really be managing our pine systems to make them more resilient to fire, making sure that we have residual trees after these disturbances that are able to restock these sites naturally rather than having to go in and salvage log and replant. And then most importantly, I think using cultural context to appropriately understand or interpret these tree ring records. We know that the Great Lakes region has been home to indigenous peoples for since the glaciers receded, so for 12,000 years. And these people were not benign occupiers of landscape. They were movers and shakers, and making sure that they were using fire in the sites that they were occupying to meet their needs for resources and shelter and safety, and all sorts of other things that I can't really get into right now. We can get a sense of the scale or magnitude of kind of this use by looking at other records like historical accounts. So Dr. John Bigsby in 1823 toured the Great Lakes, and he has multiple accounts of areas being manipulated with fire by native peoples. He says that the Indians burn large tracts of pine barrens in order to favor the growth of very useful autumnal fruits like blueberry. And so this had pretty dramatic ecological consequences in a positive way. And we've pulled out that sort of, or eliminated that caretaking sort of approach to land stewardship that Native communities were a part of prior to Euro-American colonization. John Riley, in his book, The Once and Future Great Lakes Country, great book, highly recommend it, describes Native American tending of the land. Said that fire-maintained lands promoted early successional habitats that favored nut and berry plants and grasses for wildlife. And as a result, deer, elk, turkey, passenger pigeon, and small game succumbed to a form of surrogate domestication by the customization of the land by Native people. And we can go to different parts of the Great Lakes region and get a strong sense of what these tending practices resulted in. So coming from the Red Lake Reservation, Brenda Child, a University of Minnesota professor, describes a spot at the site of present-day Ponema, Minnesota. Unlimited supplies of raspberries, blueberries, and gooseberries, immense growth of timber, game is practically unlimited, and the whole peninsula being a famous hunting ground for moose and deer. They also get many furs and have a few good hay meadows. And for a lack of market, they of course utilize a very small fraction of it, which is what a shame, right? And the quality or the productivity of these systems is kind of mind-blowing. So here's an example from the Lake of the Woods. In 1901, 160 tons of blueberries were shipped by railway to markets from Kenora, Ontario. And so this was an equivalent of $700,000 of blueberries that were harvested in a single year. And only a quarter of the crop was harvested because of the limited availability of pickers. Really don't have time to talk more about this, though I would love to. If this is captivating or of interest to you, there's a new fire documentary out talking about sort of tribal perspectives on fire. And if you want, you can go to z.umn.edu Oshkigan to watch that film, which is about 15 minutes long. So in summary, Great Lakes pine fire regimes. We know that fire occurrence was frequent. Fire was low to mixed severity across space and through time. Fire occurred in the spring, summer, and fall season, basically whenever there wasn't snow on the ground. Fire size was limited to stands, but also burned entire regions in drought years. And the fire effects were really heterogeneous over space and in time, which created, we could call that pyrodiversity. And pyrodiversity begets biodiversity. And all of these aspects of the fire regime really can be better understood with this understanding bottom-up sort of drivers of the fire regime. And in the Lake States, I really feel that cultural context, that this idea of a human augmented fire regime is very real and it needs to be talked about more. So here's a site from the Superior National Forest that I skied out to March of 2020. You can see what fire absence has done to our pine woodlands. And I don't know if you feel like this is healthy, but it's really easy to imagine what could happen to this type of system. in a dry year. And sure enough, the same area experienced a number of fires, including this big blow up called the Greenwood Fire. I don't know the exact acreage total, but this had a huge impact on the locals that were living in this area. You know, homes were lost, and there's consequences to inaction when it comes to restoring fire to our fire dependent systems, because they're going to burn eventually. And so it's really up to us to determine when they burn and how we want them to burn. And we have great data sources across the region that are beginning to answer questions at the site level that can be then extrapolated out to larger areas. And if you want these records to aid the work that you do, reach out to fire history folks that are working in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, because we're so excited to be able to talk to you. We're really passionate, and I don't know anyone that wants to collect these records and not see them used. And it's really critical that we're working with resource managers to make sure that these biological and cultural archives are directly relevant to resource stewardship now and into the future. So, closing, our fire dependent systems hold answers to questions we have not yet learned to ask. And really it's to our benefit to maintain the processes or perpetuate the processes that have shaped these systems now, so that in the future, the generations that come after us are able to learn from these systems in new ways. So with that, I'll close. Reach out to me if you've got questions over the next couple of days. Check out this fire video. I'm really proud of it. I think it's useful. And that's all I got.
Lane, that was excellent. Thank you for that review. We've got a number of good questions. I'm going to go to share my screen here. As always, I'll remind folks to go over and thumbs up those questions. Let us know which ones you want us to ask. Lane, the first question: if red pine forests were historically more savannas or woodlands, do you have any data on how much woody browse those systems produce for moose and deer relative to a closed forest?
I don't have any data to pull from immediately, but we can qualitatively say that there was loads of woody browse for moose and deer, elk, and that a big part of the productivity of these systems is from I guess a wildlife standpoint, is that these frequent fires were maintaining kind of open forest conditions that allowed for grasses and other palatable vegetation types to be available to ungulates and other browsers. And there's great accounts that talk about kind of the abundance of moose and other ungulates in these systems during the pre-fire suppression era. And I think that we've potentially lost some of that wildlife richness because of the absence of fire in much of our landscape.
Thanks, Lane. I think the Oshkogan video partly answers this, but have you utilized indigenous oral records for fire return interval determinations?
Yeah, we've had some really good conversations locally on the Fond du Lac Reservation about sort of local knowledge of how frequently sites would have been burned for blueberries, and that typically a rotation of 4 to 7 years, depending on the patch. And seems like that knowledge is mirrored across other parts of the region, up at Grand Portage, portions of northern Wisconsin, like the Red Cliff Reservation. And certainly those types of insights are super useful in thinking about interpreting the tree ring fire history record. And I think in a lot of cases, those short interval fires that were used for blueberry maintenance aren't necessarily showing up completely in the tree ring record, because they were super light burns that may not have been actually scarring trees.
Lane, next is kind of a technical question about dendrochronology, can you infer fire origin from fire seasonality or other tree ring data? So how do you figure out the origin of the fire?
Yeah, the cultural context is key in these cases, and we can never really say absolutely that fires were coming from, say, intentional ignitions from people versus coming from lightning. But there's a lot of ways we can gather multiple lines of evidence to contextualize these tree ring records that suddenly helps us go, aha, like seems very reasonable to infer that in this landscape or in this site, this frequent fire occurrence is more easily interpreted or explained by the presence of people than not. And fire seasonality is another way to get at that, looking at the occurrence of dormant season fire or the abundance of dormant season fire versus summer season, which can be a way at kind of teasing out the source of those historical ignitions, whether they occurred in lightning sort of summer season or prior to green up, and really prior to when we have heavy sort of convective thunderstorms in this region.
All right, I think we're going to have to cut it there. We're a few minutes over time. Lane, thanks again for a really excellent talk. Lane, I'm going to leave the questions on Slido for you. There are several others. If you are interested in going and posting brief replies to those questions, that would be nice. No obligation to do that, but it would be nice because we didn't get to them all. And next, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Brian Palik, our next speaker, to share his screen whenever he's ready. And Brian, I'll tell you that we are starting, I think, about 7 minutes late. Please plan to give your full talk using the amount of time that you had planned, and we can shorten. We won't end late. We won't go over time, but we can shorten our closing remarks at the end of the morning. So Brian, as soon as you are ready to share your screen, it's all yours. Have we got Brian?
Oh, Eli,
There you are.
I thought I was sharing.
Yeah, I was just beginning to get nervous. I was not seeing you right away. Great. So slides look perfect, Brian. It looks like it's displaying the way you would want it to, and you're on.
Okay, so I'll start. So I'm going to pick up really where Lane left off and talk some about what we know about pine, mixed pine ecosystems, and how really it's informed our silviculture research on the cut-foot experimental forest. So you see my title there, gives you a sense. And so what I'll do is look a little bit at the research that shapes our research. So what I mean by that is some of the research into the past that has shaped our silviculture research. And then we'll move into, I'm going to focus on a particular legacy study and also a large-scale experiment that builds on that understanding. And as others have done, I'm going to try to bust some myths along the way. So to begin, what do we know now that we did not know, or at least did not appreciate about pine systems 30 years ago? And I would argue that it's that red pine occurs in some abundance in many different native plant communities, as we call them in Minnesota, or habitat types or ecosystems. And you get a sense of that here. So these are the names from the Minnesota Native Plant Community Guidebook for the North. And you see the variety of different types of systems that have a large component of red pine. And we know that there's similar types of ecosystems with different names in Wisconsin and Michigan. And a lot of our silviculture research really focuses on that one that I circled there in northern Minnesota because it was most abundant. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is we really had a diversity of pine-dominated ecosystems with red pine as being the major component. And you would think that would translate into a diversity of management approaches. But as many of you know, it oftentimes doesn't. And we'll get into that in a bit. So what else do we know more about now? And Lane got into this. We know about disturbance regimes, particularly fire. So, you know, Heinzelman in his classic work talked about numbers like that for fire return interval. And people have oftentimes misinterpreted that to imply that These were stand replacing fires that regenerated every 150 to 250 years. Even our native plant community guideline, and this is down to FDN 33A, which is our dry mesic mixed pine forest, had that kind of catastrophic fire rotation they talked about, and then these frequent low intensity fires. But what we know, and this is building on the kind of work that Lane was talking about, from recent quantitative estimates right here, if you're in Minnesota, on the Chippewa National Forest. This is work led by Mike Stambaugh and several others and us, where he's used fire scar data to interpret fire regimes with fire intervals ranging from about 1 to 40 years across the national forest in pine systems, and a mean fire returning interval of 6.6 years, so really frequent. And there's similar studies and estimates in Wisconsin and Michigan as well. And Lane alluded to this. What we think about now for fire regimes in mixed pine systems, and this is outside of jack pine barrens, obviously, but more in the mixed pine system, mixed severity fire regimes, including less than stand replacing fire. And these folks back in the day knew this. If you look into the old literature about this, they talk about this kind of thing. It wasn't unknown, but we kind of lost track of it. So I would argue that that's a myth, if you still hold that myth or not, that fires were stand replacing in mixed pine systems. Certainly they were at some time in some places, but mostly they weren't. The other thing that we've kind of appreciated is not just about fire. So these are really mixed agent disturbance regimes, and armillaria is key. Now we think of that as being a bad thing in our pine systems, but it's a natural pathogen and it created gap openings and heterogeneity in structure, as did wind. So we also know that red pine forests were mixed species ecosystems. And Heinzelman knew that. He showed this back in the day of the age ranges for pine from work he was doing. And then there's been a lot of work in the Lake States from bearing tree records, looking at the composition of forests on those sites that supported mixed pine. And always it's cumulatively, the other species were more abundant than red pine or occurred more often. And so we look in Minnesota in this classic, there's a lot of this FDN 33A, mixed species woodland. There's 11 species there. Yeah, all 3 of the native pines are there, as they are in this picture from the Chippewa National Forest. So mixed species. The other thing we know, and Lean talked about this as well, that these are woodlands with a variable open canopy. And I would argue that these are actually quite structurally complex. And the reason for that is that variation horizontally in canopy structure. And you see that reflected in these names, that they were woodlands, according to the folks that put this guide together. And they talk about, for most of these, the range in canopy openness, which is quite variable at the stand scale, which implies structural complexity in space. And you see that. This is a system on the Seney National Wildlife Refuge, and there's to the right is the Chippewa. I mean, they look almost identical, right? So these are open forests of red and white pine with scattered reproduction in the understory. They couldn't be really barren if they were reproducing in cohorts like we'll look at in a minute. And why, again, for this, that structure, it's that mixed severity fire regime, including less than stand replacing fire. So if you had thought about these systems regenerating that way, I would suggest that is a busted myth as well, that these were closed canopy, higher density stocking forests. So what we know, and this is how we talk about these mixed pine systems, is they had complex structures, complex age structures in particular, with overstory present during regeneration events. And there's a lot of evidence for this in the old literature. Again, these folks knew this. And then if you go into those old white papers, you can see it. And this is work all done on the Chippewa National Forest. This is from their work. So look at that. Nature's own group selection. Red pine reproduction was generally shaded out within a few years, except in openings caused by tree mortality.
Cox and Dan.
The middle one, after patchy disturbance in a red pine stand. Red pine reproduction established in groups. And then that last one there, large old pines and red pine cohort regeneration, Pike Bay experimental forests. So you can see that these are really large group kind of regeneration events. And we've looked at this quantitatively in some detail. And this was work Sean Fraber and I did, where we looked at age establishment patterns, age structure of old growth red pine in northern Minnesota. And there really isn't that much of it that's truly occurs in at a stand scale, something big enough to have encompassed a disturbance regime. So we settled on these 7 stands here, and they range from being multi-cohort to broadly single cohort age structure with overstory legacy trees in varying amounts after disturbance. So you see this here, Tasca State Park, one of the stands there. This is a 50-year establishment window, so not even age, but single cohort. And then look at this. This is on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. That's a 3 cohort age structure for red pine. And those arrows indicate major fires. We didn't do that kind of fire scar work that Lane talked about, but these are recorded fires that we were able to determine. And then the other thing we did here, which is super time consuming, was tree map in half-hectare plots in each of these woodlands. So that's Sunken Lake on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest, on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. And those are the 3 age cohorts. And you see they're kind of spatially segregated. And it really kind of conveys that patchy, fairly complex structure spatially. Now, people will say to me, okay, what you're saying is probably true south of the Canadian Shield, but it wouldn't be that way on the Boreal Shield. Well, those starred stands are on the Canadian Shield, and they are extremely complex in terms of their age structure. So, that thought doesn't seem to be true. And so if you're still hanging on to this myth that red pine regenerates in even age stands, it doesn't. It's not to say it never did, but it generally doesn't. And this is not unique to Minnesota. This is also reflective of how these mixed pine systems work in Michigan and Wisconsin. And then something else that comes out of this view of these stands is they have big parts. So big dead trees, snags, downwood, and big live trees. And we've looked at this in these 7 old growth stands, and you can just see there's a lot of large trees, a lot of large snags, a lot of volume of dead wood on the ground. And that's compared to that box on the bottom, which is the mean from FIA measured data, which has very little of that. And I'm not talking about just managing or thinking about this relative to old growth here. These are long-lived structural features that should be present in younger stands that have that multi-cohort complex age structure that I was pointing out before. They survive disturbance and they should be there when new cohorts regenerate, but we tend not to manage them that way. So to summarize, our understanding of natural disturbance and the resultant structure, mixed severity, including less than stand replacing fire, other disturbance agents like armillaria that reinforce that, complex and variable age structures, mixed species, woodlands with variable canopy cover across space. And you know that management for pine, when we're focusing on timber, rarely emulates that. Rather we do this. We really manage for even age stands, spatial homogeneity, high density, favoring the A line on the stocking chart for red pine, short rotations, depending on who you are, strongly red pine dominated, oftentimes other species are discouraged, and using even age regeneration systems. Now, I don't want you to think that I think there's anything wrong with that model. If your goal is to optimize timber production of red pine, then it's a good way to do it. But if your objectives include something other than that as the priority, then there may be other ways. And mine do include such objectives. So really our work has been about, since the beginning, silviculture to restore, sustain, adapt, red pine, really mixed species ecosystems, better emulate a natural model. And how do we do this? So I'm kind of shifting gears here. One way we do this is through repurposing what I call legacy studies. So old studies established largely for growth and yield. We have hundreds of these in our files. In fact, we have jack pine thinning studies that date back to 1950. But for red pine and really mixed pine systems where these are at, we focus on this group here. We've done a lot with it in terms of this repurposing. So you can see there, and you can see how old they are. So repurposed to address things like climate change adaptation, carbon management, extended rotation forestry, heaven forbid I say that in Minnesota, but we have been looking at that. And what I want to do is focus in on this one as an example of addressing that. So the red pine level of growing stock study. Some of you have been to this. It's on the Cutfoot experimental forest, and the whole idea was growth and yield in older red pine across a range of stocking levels. The people that put this study in didn't care about extended rotation. They cared about adding some data points to the end of the age range for their growth and yield model. But we saw the opportunity to really start looking at how old pine systems that are managed work. So there's the stocking levels in English ranging from 60 to 140 square feet, and then in metric. So the interesting thing about this is this was installed in 1949 in 85-year-old stands. The treatment sizes were ranging from 2.5 to 5 acres, which they probably thought were big, but by modern standards, that's really small, as you'll see in a bit. Replicated 4 times, didn't have a control, but we've since added one from that old girl stand in the Cutfoot experimental forest. And these things have been thinned, like 6 to 8 times, depending on the treatment. The stands are now 157 years old, and of course, we still work in them. So what do? Well, we've studied growth and yield, the original purpose, and carbon storage and drought adaptation. We published on all those, and I'll touch on each briefly. So again, looking at growth, there's the stocking range. What this shows is periodic annual increment across the stocking range and then mean annual increment. It's in metric, but it's 60 to 140 again. And you can see that both those measures of growth increase across the growing stock level from low to high, but not a lot of them in the middle there are significantly different from each other. What we do think is 60 square feet is understocked from a growth and yield perspective relative to all the other treatments. And I should have mentioned though that there's some other desirable characteristics of that stocking level, which we'll get to. So here's a little bit more on growth. Tony D'Amato, who's worked on this with us, put this together recently. So this shows periodic and mean annual increment across time in 2 of the stocking levels, 80 and 120, but the others kind of look the same. And here's what you should note about those circles. Thin red pine stands reach a peak MAI at ages well beyond those ascribed in normal yield tables. So we don't generally think about them culminating at 130 years old. Stand level production is responsive to thinning, even at advanced age. And you see that in these upturns in periodic annual increment, but also going back in time. The T's are thinning, by the way. The T's represent a thinning date. When that slope changes from being less negative, that's a response as well. And then finally, mean annual increment, the dashed line remains relatively constant after this peak, right in here or so, providing justification for basing rotation on links on objectives other than maximizing mean annual increment. So again, I would suggest this is a busted myth. Old trees don't grow, they do. Won't respond to release, they do. And mean annual increment always peaks early. That's not always true. People have looked at this in Douglas fir, I'm sure other forest types, and it's the same kind of thing for these long live species that we think about being intolerant, but as you'll see, are kind of sort of tolerant. The other thing we've looked at here is carbon storage, and this is obviously carbon is becoming a commodity that you're managing for and selling, and we've looked at it in this study. So it's a little bit hard to see. You'll have to get close to your screen there, but this is carbon across the stocking range, including old growth control on the far right that we added in different pools. Forest floor, mineral soil, dead wood, et cetera. The top is total ecosystem carbon. And the thing to note there is that unmanaged old growth has the most carbon relative to all the managed systems. And you might say, well, yeah, but you're not accounting for wood removed in those 6 or 8 or 9 thinnings. Well, we've looked at that. So that shows here, this is massive carbon removed in the 5 thinning treatments. And most of the products here have been large poles, cabin logs, and large saw timber. So they have long life, shelf life once they get out of the woods. So you add that number together, those numbers with that top total ecosystem carbon, and it looks like this. Old growth, unmanaged control still stores the most carbon when you add those two things together. And that's something that has been kind of looked at and dealt with in other forest types. But the other kind of interesting thing here is all the thinning treatments have about the same amount of total carbon when you add on-site with removed. And so what that suggests to me is that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what a forester might do when picking a stocking level to manage to. That's a good thing, right? So maybe this is a myth for some of you. On-site and harvested carbon together exceeds carbon in unmanaged old growth. That's not true. And again, it's not true for any forest type I'm aware of that people have looked at. The last thing we've done with this kind of old study is look at drought adaptation, or maybe it's mitigation. And we do this by looking at stocking level, using relative density, and comparing that to growth response to a drought, during the drought, after the drought. And the two metrics that people talk about for this is resistance, which is, and we do this with tree rings, and then converting diameter of tree rings to basal area increment. So it's basal area increment during a drought compared to before, that's resistance. And resilience is basal area increment after a drought compared to before. So how did it recover? And here's the take home from that study. So these are two drought events that we looked at this on, 1956 and 2006. And then the left shows, oops, I see my stocking numbers are out of place there. So it's relative density, but those groupings relate to 60, 100, and 140 square feet. And the point here is that the slopes are negative for resilience, for both drought events across stocking levels, and for resistance. And what that means is lower relative density or basal area increases resistance and resilience of growth to drought. Evidence that these forests can be managed to mitigate drought stress during with density management. So really kind of favoring more of the B line, A line, the B line of the stocking chart. Okay, so that was that legacy study and how we use our understanding of, that these forests can grow to be really old, the trees, and have interesting structures, and you can kind of manage for that with that. The other thing we do to address this objective is we use operational scale experiments. By that I mean big scale stuff where the timber harvest and the related ongoing management activities are at scales characteristic of the organization. And what we want to do, and this isn't pine in this picture, but is to embrace heterogeneity in ecological conditions that are often encountered by management, rather than exclude them like those old legacy studies did. They tried to set up things like agricultural field studies and exclude heterogeneity. We do the opposite of that. So we have several of these kinds of experiments in pine on the Chippewa National Forest, and these show the three main ones. This middle one here is in plantation. I'm not going to talk about it today. The bottom one is our latest climate adaptation experiment, and I'll talk about that on Thursday. What I want to do is focus on this one for just a minute. Our red pine variable retention harvesting experiment, which is 20 years old now. And that general idea is to restore complexity in structure and composition in natural origin stands. So here's what it looks like. You're looking down on an air photo of one of the blocks. And we'll talk about these treatments here in a bit, but the applied objective is to restore multi-cohort woodland structure in diverse tree communities in simplified red pine forests. These are natural origin forests, but they were 95% red pine in even age post severe fire. And the approach, we started this back when variable retention harvesting was just, the newest buzzword and people were interested in it. So we varied the spatial pattern of retention along with shrub reduction to manipulate heterogeneity of resources. That was really the kind of science goal. This was big scale at the time, 25 hectare treatment units, 4 blocks, 4 treatments. And then we planted, in addition to the harvesting and shrub control, we planted red jack and eastern white pine because at least jack and eastern white pine had kind of fallen out of these systems. And then there's shrub control, either with or without manual removal. And we're studying all kinds of things in here. The treatments look like this. So you're looking down on this block. I call this top one aggregated gap-based retention. So these are 3/4 acre openings. And this is quarter acre openings, and there was sometimes thinning in between the openings as well. This is what I call dispersed retention, and then uncut down here. All three of the harvesting would cut to, the target was 70 square feet per acre. We got to about 72. And if I forget to say it, the planting that we'll look at occurred across the whole stands. So not just in the openings. And then each was divided in half with shrub control, ambient shrubs or reduced shrubs. So what are we trying to do with that? Well, we're trying to do this. Think back to the stem map for Sunken Lake. We're trying to emulate in a little more controlled environment this group or patch sort of regeneration dynamic that occurred in some of these examples of this ecosystem. So control, it was about 200 square feet in that control, and then dispersed large gaps shown here, both cut to 72. The other thing we're trying to do, we had hoped to have prescribed fire introduced in this, but it didn't happen. So we took a surrogate approach with manual reduction of shrubs, mostly hazel and aspen suckers when those occurred. And you just see that, you know, we were successful with that over time by reducing the density of those things in the understory in all the treatments. And then planted this bare root stock of those 3 pines, and they were all planted about 200 per acre each, so 600 total. Okay, so what this is showing is pine survival over about a 7-year period, the 3 pines. So declining survival, not surprisingly, over time. And it's the 4 treatments, retention treatments, uncut control, and then the 3 harvesting approaches. And then top is with ambient shrub levels, and the bottom is with, says absent, but it's shrubs reduced. And here's kind of the take home for all 3 of these. Jack pine on the far left, when you look at its survival, and it's really dependent on just kind of removing some of that overstory, that it can be tolerant of some shade. And when you remove the shrub layer, the hazel layer, then it has almost the same survival in the uncut forest as well. Red pine in the middle, mostly it's an overstory influence. So you see this big drop off in survival in the uncut forest, but all 3 of the cutting patterns are about the same. So tolerant of some moderate shade again, 72 at the time of cutting, and now they're probably at 90 to 100 square feet. And then we'll get back to that drop off there. It's, you know, reduced resources, but probably also shoot blight. And then one white pine on the far right, tolerant of everything, shade, shrubs, doesn't care, does really well. So this was work that we did with Rebecca Montgomery. She did this really elegant study of trying to get at jack pine and shade tolerance in this work. And the myth, I would say, is that jack pine is shade intolerant. Maybe somewhat it is, but it's really what those shading plants do to soil resources that matters more. So you get rid of that, jack pine can tolerate moderate shade for survival and growth. So this shows growth. This is after about 15 years. And it's the 2 intolerant pines, jack pine on the left, red pine on the right. It's height and diameter growth, all planted at, you know, their same size for the species. So size after 15 years represents growth. And I'm just showing the control uncut to this 3/4 acre gap aggregated retention. And, you know, you can see that reduction in overstory matters, but reduction in the shrub layer matters as well. Again, not just planting in the gap, this is averaging across the entire stands for these 2. So I thought there was, yeah. So partial cutting matters, but then shade or getting rid of shrubs matters, perhaps in some cases even more. So let's just look at this pine density thing. Go back to this. This is density after 15 years, and it's the control versus the large gap. And it's all 3 species, red, jack, and white, and it's ambient shrubs and reduced shrubs. So what you can see from this is that partial cutting does matter in terms of pine density. This is, you know, it's not showing survival curves. It's showing what's there after 15 years. So you have more for all 3 species with partial cutting. And then if you have reduced shrubs, you have even more of all 3 species. Now, here's the thing. This is kind of the last myth I want to deal with, in my opinion. There's overstory present during this regeneration event, just like the natural model that I started this out with. So yes, this is a large gap treatment, but it's large gaps with matrix in between, and we plan it across, and this reflects that. As many of you know, you can't do that because of shoot blight. We're not supposed to be pursuing retention harvesting, where shoot blight's an issue when we want to regenerate red pine. But yet this, okay? You can see the red pine density after 15 years in this treatment, and you can see that it's even higher. Yeah, some have died, started about 200 per acre, we're at maybe 120, but there's still a fair amount there. And so why is that? First, I guess I would suggest this. This is one of the myths. I know shoot blight is an issue, a really bad issue in some places, but what I'd like to say is that the threat of shoot blight, this is the myth. That means you can never use retention harvesting, and I just don't think that's true. So what's the issue here? So probably most of you know with variable retention harvesting shoot blight. Well, we have these two species, Diplodia, which is triggered by moisture stress and wounding, and Syrococcus, triggered by wet springs, high humidity. All pines are susceptible, but especially red pine, where those spores rain down from the overstory into the regenerating trees. And some of the spores are in the cones as well, or slash. What I like to say is this: it's not bad everywhere. So why give up on retention everywhere? Some pines void or survive infection, as this work shows. And then there are things you can do to reduce the impact. So long-term survival of red pine regeneration can be increased with what? Retention that includes larger openings. So if you get, I'm sure most of the survivors in that large gap treatment were in those openings as opposed to under canopy. So having those larger openings, which is consistent with the natural model, and then shrub reduction really seems to make a difference. So opening that understory, maybe it's a humidity thing, a competition thing. People have suggested to me that our shoot blight issue is bad because of our lack of fire. So perhaps I don't know if that's true, but perhaps greater use of prescribed fire would reduce shrubs and spores. And then the last thing that I like to talk about here is this idea of alternation of pine dominance. These are mixed pine ecosystems. In some places, at some times, red pine was probably the dominant. In some places, white pine was probably the dominant. You can take advantage of that natural variability in your silviculture and think about doing this, where you have a harvest where you retain mostly red pine in the overstory, and you focus on regenerating jack pine and white pine. Or you have a harvest where you focus on retaining white pine in the overstory, and that's where you focus on regenerating red pine or jack pine. So you can break up that association of overstory and understory species. So I'm gonna just finish up by the lessons that I glean from this. And this is managing pines closer to a natural model, which has been our objective. Old pines still grow. They sequester carbon and they respond to release. Time of maximum MAI can be extended with thinning to old ages. Old unmanaged forests store more carbon than managed forests, even when you add in the wood removal that has taken place. Lower pine stocking conveys a resistance and resilience of growth to drought. I didn't say this, but we kind of talk about 100 square feet as being that magic number between maintaining decent growth and conveying a drought resistant strategy. Jack and red pines are tolerant of moderate shade. Controlling shrubs really has a large positive impact on survival and growth due to the impacts of that plant layer on soil resources. And then regenerating pines with retention harvesting is not always. It is sometimes, but it's not always a Diplodia death sentence. There may be ways to mitigate that impact. And so I have been talking here, but I'll just point out all these people, work that I referred to were done by these people with us, and I just want to acknowledge them. So Eli, with that, I am done.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you very much. Another good talk that I think really set us up well for a good session over the next few days. I am going to share my screen one more time. You all know the routine by now. I am going to remind you, as I just did in the chat, to go ahead and not only post questions, but also upvote questions so that we know which ones you want us to ask, that you're most interested in. First question, Brian, with shoot blights, and you did talk about this at some length near the end of the talk, but a lot of people are interested, and I wonder if you might say more. With shoot blights like Diplodia and Scleroderma so prevalent, is it unreasonable to think that there can be multi-cohort pine stands with red pine being a major component? Anything to add to your early remarks on that?
Well, I'd like to think that I pointed out that it's not unreasonable to think that based on what I just showed you. I can tell you that's not our only study where we've had that kind of survival long-term of red pine. We have work with on Red Lake Wildlife Management Area that shows the same thing with that kind of structure that you can mitigate it to some degree.
Great, thank you. Next question. So if resistance and resilience are inversely proportional to basal area, what to do with neglected red pine plantations that are too dense, not thinned for a long time? Can they still be thinned? Are they too far gone? How do you tell the difference?
Well, you know, there's more going on in that question than just a drought response in terms of whether trees are too far gone. I guess, you know, the Don Dickman at Michigan State, when I was at school, taught us about they're too far gone if they have less than a third of their crown left. And so you have to look at some of those health characteristics in terms of how the trees are growing to know if they're too far gone. But we have done this work in plantations as well, old plantations, and they show that same kind of response on the Superior National Forest where we've done it.
Okay, next up, when doing some of these thinnings, are you looking to retain, and this question actually came in initially for laying, but and again, I think you've talked about this a bit, Brian, but I think it relates to both. When doing some of these thinnings and some of these treatments you described, are you looking to retain non-pine species to better mimic the woodland aesthetic?
Yes, we do. Keith knows this. He's setting me up here, I think. We definitely do that. So if we have a study, and we'll talk about one on Thursday where we've done that, but in that retention study as well, if there's large non-red pine, we favor that retention. And if it's there, it's just not always there in our managed forests if that's what you're starting with. So we definitely try to look to retain and increase that non-pine, non-red pine especially component.
I think this would be a good question for other folks, since there are so many folks also managing pine systems, to chime in either through the chat or other ways on Slido on what they're doing or how they're tackling this question too.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Marcel. I'm glad you jumped in. I think, you know, I've been encouraging folks to reply to questions as well, and I think this is a good example of one that that a lot of folks would have a lot of ideas on. And so I encourage folks to post replies. What I've been doing is I've been archiving questions kind of as we go, so that we don't have questions from, say, Carrie and Nick this morning during this Q&A session. I just want people to be able to see the questions. But I will be restoring all of those questions along with the replies that anyone has posted, whether it's the speaker or anyone else. Those will all be available immediately after the end of the session this morning in a few minutes. And I encourage folks to go back and post additional replies and so on. But I agree with Marcella. If anyone has additional responses, use the Zoom chat or post a reply to Slido. And I see a few things coming in here on the chat. Anyway, why don't we, in our couple of minutes left, why don't we do another question or two for Brian, and then we'll do some quick concluding remarks. Someone just gave a thumbs up to this one by Chris Gronewald, so we'll go to this one next. Brian, your shoot blight results are for 15-year-old trees, and you did see some mortality at that age. Given the rate of mortality, will we still have a fully stocked stand? Yeah, maybe it. Well, again, you've kind of discussed the different objectives and so forth that inform a question like that. Anything to add there?
Yeah, so one, what's a fully stocked stand in a woodland? Yeah. So we're trying to restore woodland characteristics to these. And I don't know exactly our 15-year results. I haven't tracked I haven't plotted the survivor curves, which first ones I showed you only went to about 7 years. So I don't know exactly where that mortality occurred. We are literally right now, of course, the snow is kind of deep, remeasuring the study now. So we'll have a sense, and I think they would be 20 years old. So we'll have a sense at that. But you know, whether there's going to be red pine there at 30, 60, 90, obviously I can't say for sure. But we'll take a look at what the mortality rate has been like from 15 to 5, or excuse me, 15 to 20.
And Brian, can you comment on that? So the next question, I think the last one we'll take now. Can you estimate or share with people the percentage of Diplodia infected overstory pine in the stands treated for variable density pine study? I actually initially read that as the rate of infection for seedlings.
Yeah,
But I guess the question is
overstory.
about the overstory, the dominant trees in those.
No, we didn't look at that at all, other than if any of you remember the Forest Service when Mike Ostry was our pathologist researcher in St. Paul, and he worked on this with us, and he walked through all our stands and said, "Yep, you got what you play." You know, so that's about the extent that I can tell you. We didn't try to quantify.
All right, and I guess I want to do one other because Matt Petz-Shiger has posted this question a couple of times and not gotten an answer yet. Can you speak, Brian, to the cutoff, the sort of basal area cutoff between a woodland and a forest system?
Yeah.
How far should we thin when we start to improve? How far should we thin to start improving wildlife benefits?
I don't know what the basal area cutoff should be. It's a good question. People have looked at that in other systems, like Lane showed that diagram for work that looked at that. So I don't know what it is. We have not pursued wildlife related research in that kind of study. We have with birds, I should say that, but what we feel is, like I said, that 60 square feet is probably too low relative to a productivity standpoint. We like to talk about 80 to 100, and that's kind of the range where a red pine retention experiment was at too, you know, in that 70, mid 70s, and now it's more. So, you know, that's sort of our perspective, is not getting too low that it's not productive, and how that translates into wildlife benefits, I couldn't say in detail.
All right, well, I said we were not going to go over time. Brian, thank you very much. Likewise, thanks to Lane and Marcella and Carrie and Nick for really good presentations to get this 3-day symposium off the ground. I have just restored all of the questions on Slido, so those will exist as something that you can look at and refer to. Quick reminders from me. One, we will have the same schedule tomorrow. So today we were kind of looking to the past. What can we learn from tree ring records and from long-term studies like Brian described, and studies of genetics and other things. Tomorrow we'll hear from 3 different panels, one on jack pine, one on white pine, one on red pine, talking about basically current practices on each of those species from different agencies and organizations. And then on Thursday, we'll kind of look to the future with what we know about climate adaptation from a genetics and forest management and other standpoints. Again, I want to thank you all for coming today. Keep in mind, you still have the link for the questions that you came up with during our short breakout session. I will post that question in just a moment in the chat when I stop talking. I see in the chat that Mike Ty has a quick reminder. So Mike, if you want to unmute, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Eli. Yeah, I just a quick reminder for the Forest Service participants. For those of you seeking certification or revalidation, we have an assignment that we've circulated by email. So those folks who are seeking certification or validation, please take a look at that today. It'll be due Friday, and contact me with any questions. But that should be in your email box. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mike. My clock shows 11:59, so I think I'm going to bring us to a close. Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out by email. You should all have my email address in your inbox. Thanks again to our speakers today for a really good day, and to all of you for posting great questions and both on your slides in the breakout session and on Slido and elsewhere. And we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Central. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.